A poor night shift cleaner braved a rainy Chicago night to save a pregnant young woman from a burning car, then gave her own rare blood to win back 2 lives, never knowing the woman was the little sister of the most powerful mafia boss in the city, a cold-hearted man who nonetheless held loyalty sacred and carried the deepest of wounds within him. One split-second decision, and the fates of these strangers would be changed forever. Before we begin the story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to support us, and we hope you enjoy the story. Stay with me, listen to me, you have to hold on, for the baby. Nora Whitfield whispered hoarsely, as she clutched the bleeding woman against her chest, standing in the middle of rain so thick it turned the street into a shattered black mirror, waving desperately toward the headlights sweeping past. Her cleaner's uniform was soaked through, her arms trembling from exhaustion, but she didn't dare loosen her hold for even a second, because in her arms 2 heartbeats were fading together. Nora had just finished her night shift at a downtown office building when a crash tore through the storm, and she saw the black SUV overturned by the roadside. The driver was already gone, and the young woman trapped in the back seat was cradling her swollen belly, drawing each breath as fragile as a guttering candle. When a taxi finally pulled over to the curb, Nora lifted the woman inside and urged the driver straight to the hospital, and when the blood bank ran nearly dry, it was she who rolled up her sleeve and gave her own rare O-negative blood, the one thing money could not buy in time that night, before slipping away, before anyone could even ask her name. Nora didn't know the name of the woman she had saved. Still less did she know she had just pulled from death's hands the little sister of Dante Castellano, a name all of Chicago dared only whisper behind closed doors. But some debts a man like Dante Castellano never lets fade into forgetting. The next morning, standing silent at the hospital bed, he gave only a single command, his voice low and cold as steel. "Find the woman who saved my sister, whatever it takes." He had no idea yet that this woman held nothing in her hands but a kind heart, and the scars that a life of misfortune had etched into her, and that this one rainy night would change them all, forever. Dawn had barely begun to bleed gray light over the rooftops of the south side when Nora Whitfield climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment, her borrowed hospital scrubs damp beneath a coat that still carried the faint metallic scent of the night before. The building was old and tired, much like the neighborhood around it, and the single room she called home held little more than a sagging couch, a kettle, a shelf of second-hand paperbacks, and a windowsill where a lone geranium struggled to bloom in a cracked clay pot. She did not turn on the light. She simply lowered herself onto the couch, still wearing her shoes, and stared at the ceiling while the city stirred awake beyond the thin glass. Her whole body ached. Her arm throbbed dully where the needle had drawn her blood, yet what kept her from sleep was not exhaustion but the memory of a young woman's fading breath against her chest, and the strange certainty that she would never know whether that stranger had truly survived the night. Nora had learned long ago not to expect the world to tell her how her small kindnesses ended. She had once believed life would be gentler than this. 3 years earlier, she had owned a tiny flower shop on a quiet corner, a place where the windows steamed with morning warmth and the air smelled of eucalyptus and fresh roses, where brides came to choose their bouquets and old men bought single carnations for wives they had loved for half a century. It had been hers, every bucket and ribbon and cold tile floor of it, until a bad winter, a rising stack of unpaid bills, and a loan she could never quite outrun had closed the door for good. The bankruptcy had taken more than the shop. It had taken the version of herself who still believed that working hard was enough to keep the people she loved safe. Now she scrubbed floors and emptied bins in a glass office tower downtown, arriving after the last executive had gone home and leaving long after midnight, moving through those polished corridors like a ghost that no one ever thanked or noticed. She preferred it that way, most nights. Being invisible meant being left alone with her thoughts, and her thoughts always circled back to the same place. Nearly all of what she earned went to a modest care home on the far edge of the city, where her grandmother, Ruth, lived in a room with a window that faced a small courtyard of maple trees. Ruth had raised Nora after her parents were gone, a retired librarian with soft hands and an endless supply of stories, and now those stories were slipping away from her one by one, carried off by an illness that stole memory the way tide steals footprints from sand. Some days Ruth knew her granddaughter at once and reached for her with a delighted cry. Other days she gazed at Nora with polite, distant courtesy and asked whether she had come about the overdue books. Nora had learned not to correct her. She had learned instead to bring flowers, always flowers, because even on the days when Ruth forgot her name, the old woman's face would soften at the scent of them, as though love had found a way to outlast memory itself. As the first pale sunlight finally reached the geranium on the sill, Nora closed her eyes and thought, without a trace of pride, that she had done nothing extraordinary. A person had been dying, and she had happened to be the one standing there. Anyone would have done the same, she told herself, though somewhere deep down she knew that was not true, that most people would have looked away, dialed a number, and let the rain wash the moment clean. She did not want gratitude, or money, or a name attached to what she had done. She only hoped, as sleep at last began to pull her under, that somewhere across the city, a young woman was still breathing, still holding one hand over a rounded belly, still carrying a small unborn life toward a morning she herself might never hear about. And with that quiet, unanswered wish, Nora Whitfield drifted into a dreamless sleep, unaware that the night she had already begun to forget was about to reach forward and change every ordinary day that still lay ahead of her. Across the city, in the private wing of a hospital where money bought silence as easily as it bought clean sheets, Dante Castellano stood at the foot of a narrow white bed and did not move. He was a tall man of 33, lean and hard as a drawn blade, with black hair swept back from a face carved into sharp, unforgiving angles, dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and a thin, pale scar tracing the edge of his left brow that most men were too frightened to ask about. On his right hand he wore a plain silver ring, the only thing his father had left him that he still valued, and he turned it slowly with his thumb as he watched his sister breathe. Isabella lay pale against the pillows, 24 years old and impossibly small beneath the machines, one hand resting instinctively over the gentle curve of her belly even in sleep, and the sight of her there undid something in him that no enemy had ever managed to reach. For years the name Castellano had been spoken across Chicago in a lowered voice, in the hush that follows the mention of ports and warehouses and hotels whose ownership no one dared examine too closely. Dante had inherited an empire built by his father through fear, and he had spent the last several years dragging it, piece by reluctant piece, into the daylight of legitimate business, trading old debts of blood for boardrooms and lawyers and quarterly reports. He had grown colder with every year of that work, more disciplined, more alone, and when his wife had been taken from him 3 years earlier in a single violent night, he had thought he had learned the final lesson the world had to teach him, that everything he loved could be used against him. After that, he had let the frost close over his heart entirely, and only Isabella, his little sister, the last of his blood, had remained warm enough to reach him. Now she lay before him breathing on borrowed strength, and the man who had ordered other men to their ruin without blinking found that his hands were not quite steady. The door opened without a knock, and Silas Ward stepped inside, a broad, bald mountain of a man with a soldier's stillness and scarred knuckles, the head of Dante's security, and one of the very few people alive who could bring him bad news without fear. Silas closed the door softly and spoke in the low, careful voice of a man laying evidence on a table. The crash had not been an accident, he said. He had walked the intersection himself before dawn, spoken to the right people, pulled the right footage, and the pattern was unmistakable. The delivery truck had not skidded by chance. It had been waiting, positioned, aimed. The men behind it belonged to the Voss organization, the rival that had spent the last year testing the edges of Castellano territory, and they had struck at Isabella precisely because she was the one thing left that could wound Dante to the core. They had meant for her to die in that overturned car, and by every calculation they had made, she should have. For a long moment Dante said nothing. The rage that rose in him did not show itself as heat, but as a terrible, deepening quiet, the kind that made even Silas hold his breath. They had reached for his sister to reach for him, and they had believed the matter finished, believed her already buried. He looked down at Isabella's sleeping face, at the small hand curved protectively over the child she carried, and he understood with cold clarity how close he had come to losing the last two people in the world who mattered to him. Then Silas told him the rest, the part that made no sense to a man who trusted only strategy and self-interest. Isabella had not been saved by luck, nor by any of Dante's men, nor by anyone who stood to gain a single thing from it. A stranger had pulled her from the wreck, carried her to the hospital, given her own rare blood when the supply ran dry, and then vanished into the storm without leaving so much as a name. Dante turned the silver ring once more upon his finger, and when at last he spoke, his voice was low and even and utterly without mercy. "Find her," he said. "Find the woman who saved my sister, whatever it costs, and bring me her name." It took Silas Ward less than a day to give the stranger a name, and the ease of it was precisely what troubled him. A woman who had vanished into a storm without waiting for thanks might have believed herself unfindable, but the modern city forgets nothing, and Silas knew exactly where to look for the things it remembered. He began with the intersection, pulling the footage from the traffic cameras that watched over that stretch of wet asphalt, and there, grainy and rain-blurred but unmistakable, was the whole of it laid bare, a small figure in a soaked uniform kneeling beside the overturned car, working at the shattered window, dragging a limp weight free of the wreck, then standing at the curb with a body cradled against her chest, and one arm flung out toward the passing headlights, until a taxi at last slowed to a stop. He traced that taxi through its dispatch records to the doors of the hospital, and from there the trail ran straight into the emergency department, where the log of that chaotic night recorded a walk-in blood donor, rare O-negative, who had given freely and then declined to leave her details for any follow-up. But a hospital, like a city, keeps more than people intend it to keep, and buried in the intake paperwork was a name written in a tired nurse's hand, matched to an address and a date of birth, and so the woman who had wished to remain no one at all became, in the space of a single afternoon, entirely known. The file Silas carried into the study that evening was thinner than any Dante had ever been handed on a person of interest, and its very slightness said more than a thick one ever could. Her name was Nora Whitfield, 27 years old. 3 years earlier she had owned a small flower shop that had failed and dragged her into bankruptcy, the sort of quiet financial ruin that leaves no headlines and no mercy. She now worked nights cleaning the offices of a downtown tower, earning little and keeping less, because the greater part of everything she made was paid each month to a care home on the edge of the city, where her grandmother lived with an illness that was slowly emptying her of her memories. There was no husband, no wealthy relation, no hidden leverage, no angle that a man in Dante's world would recognize. There was only a woman with nothing, who had given away the one thing that could not be bought in time. Dante read the pages twice, slowly, turning the silver ring on his finger as he did. He had spent his entire life among people who could be understood through their wants, the politicians who flattered him for favors, the executives who admired him for contracts, the enemies who feared him for what he might take from them, and every one of them had reached toward his name expecting something in return. Nora Whitfield had reached toward a dying stranger in the rain expecting nothing, had bled for a woman she could not name, and had then walked away before anyone could offer her a single thing. He did not know what to make of a person like that, and the not knowing was a sensation so unfamiliar that it held him longer than gratitude alone ever could. It was not warmth he felt, not yet, only a cold, exact curiosity sharpening into something close to respect, the wary interest of a man who had believed he had seen every kind of human motive and had just been shown one he could not account for. Yet even as he closed the file, a colder thought settled over him, and he set the pages down and looked toward Silas, with a new hardness in his eyes. If a single afternoon of cameras and paperwork had led him so easily to her door, he said quietly, then the men who had wanted Isabella dead could walk the very same path. They would learn soon enough that their target had survived, and they would ask the same question he had asked, and follow the same trail he had followed, straight to a woman who had no idea that saving one life had just placed her own in the shadow of a war she had never chosen to enter. 2 days later, on a gray afternoon when the last of the autumn leaves clung stubbornly to the maples in the care home courtyard, Nora stepped out through the front doors and stopped short at the sight waiting for her at the edge of the parking lot. 3 black cars stood in a quiet row beneath the bare trees, and beside the first of them, in a charcoal overcoat that had clearly cost more than she earned in a year, stood a tall man she had never seen and yet somehow recognized at once, the way one recognizes a storm on the horizon before the first drop of rain. He was younger than she would have guessed for a man who carried himself with such stillness, dark and lean and severe, with a thin scar above one brow, and eyes that seemed to weigh her before he had spoken a single word. 2 other men lingered a few steps behind him, watchful and silent, but it was the man in the overcoat who drew off his leather gloves and stepped forward, not with the swagger she might have expected from someone so obviously powerful, but with a strange, deliberate care, as though he wished to speak to her without any barrier between them. He told her his name, Dante Castellano, and though she did not move in the world where that name carried weight, she saw in the way his men held themselves that it was a name meant to be feared. He told her, in a low and even voice, that the young woman she had pulled from the wreck was his sister, that she and the child she carried were alive because of what Nora had done in the rain, and that he had come himself because he did not believe a debt like that should be settled through messengers. Then he nodded, and one of the men behind him stepped forward and set a black case upon the hood of the nearest car, and Dante opened it with his own hands. Inside, arranged in neat and silent rows, was more money than Nora had ever seen gathered in one place, enough to erase every debt that had ever chased her, enough to lift her grandmother's care and her own crushed years free of the weight that bent them, and he turned it gently toward her without pressure, without triumph, and said only that no brother could ever truly repay what she had given, but that he could not allow such a kindness to go unanswered. Nora looked at the money for only a moment, and something in her went very still. She thought of the flower shop she had lost, of the winter that had taken it, of all the nights she had walked home in the cold counting coins against an invoice she could not pay, and she understood exactly what that case could buy back for her. And then she closed it, quietly, with both hands, and pushed it back across the hood toward him. She was not angry, and she did not make a speech of it. She simply told him, in a voice worn thin by exhaustion but steady all the same, that she had saved a person because a person had needed saving, and that if it had been any stranger at all lying broken in that car, she would have done precisely the same thing. She had not carried his sister through the storm in the hope of a reward, she said, and to take one now would turn something that had been simply human into a transaction, and she did not want that. For a long moment, Dante Castellano said nothing at all, and in that silence, something shifted behind his dark eyes. He had come expecting one of the reactions he had spent his whole life cataloging, the greed that would seize the case at once, or the fear that would refuse it while trembling, or the flattery that would gush thanks in the hope of more. Instead, this small, tired woman with the scent of flowers still clinging faintly to her coat had looked at a fortune and at the most dangerous man in Chicago with the same clear, unimpressed gaze, and had judged them both not by what they could do to her, but by what her own conscience would allow. She neither feared him nor courted him. She had answered only to herself. And Dante, who had believed he had already met every kind of person the world could produce, inclined his head slowly and accepted her refusal without a single word of argument, feeling the cold curiosity he had carried to that parking lot deepen, almost against his will, into something he had not offered another living soul in years, a quiet and genuine respect. Dante returned to his office that evening carrying the unopened case exactly as it had left, and rather than feeling slighted by her refusal, he found himself turning it over in his mind the way he turned the silver ring upon his finger, unable to set it down. A woman who would not take a fortune offered freely was a woman who could not be repaid in the only language he had ever known. And that, he decided, was precisely why he would find another way. He summoned his oldest advisor to the study late that night, Franklin Doyle, a lean and silver-haired man of 59 with wire-framed glasses and the soft, patient voice of someone who had spent a quarter of a century solving problems before they could ever reach a courtroom. Frank had served the Castellano family since Dante's father ran it, had stood at the old man's side through every storm, and had remained through the long years of transformation because he claimed to believe in the legitimate empire Dante was building, and there was no one Dante trusted more completely to arrange a thing quietly and without a trace. He handed Frank the thin file on Nora Whitfield and gave him a single instruction, spoken low and without room for question. "Help her," he said, "but do it so that she can never give it back, and never let a word of it lead to me." Frank understood at once, and within the week the quiet machinery of unseen kindness began to turn. The administrator of the care home telephoned Nora one gray morning to tell her, with warm bewilderment, that an anonymous charitable foundation had cleared every outstanding balance on her grandmother's account and pledged to cover the cost of her care for years to come, and when Nora insisted there had to be some mistake, that no such foundation could know her family, the woman gently assured her the documents had been verified by attorneys and the payments had already cleared. Nora left that office in a daze, half convinced that some forgotten friend from Ruth's teaching days had finally stepped forward from the past. Then the small strangenesses began to gather. She came home one afternoon to find workmen repairing the water damage that had stained her ceiling for as long as she had lived beneath it. And within days, the broken radiator that had never once kept out the winter was replaced with one that hummed and held its heat. The loose stair railing that had threatened to give way under her hand for 2 years was quietly reinforced. A locksmith fitted her door with a heavier bolt, and technicians mounted a small, discreet camera above the entrance, all of it explained away by a landlord who seemed as baffled as she was, muttering something about an investor who had unexpectedly agreed to fund improvements throughout the aging building. Nora accepted it the way the poor learn to accept sudden mercies, with gratitude tangled in unease, not quite daring to ask too closely where such fortune came from. But it was the car that finally silenced her doubt and replaced it with something colder. She finished another long night of scrubbing floors and stepped out into the small hours to find a modest silver sedan parked at the curb outside her building, clean and unremarkable, and, when she checked with trembling hands, registered legally in her own name. There was no salesman, no paperwork to sign, no explanation waiting for her, only a single card tucked beneath the wiper, written in a careful hand she did not recognize, bearing no signature at all. No one, it read, should have to walk home alone after midnight. Nora stood in the empty street with the rain misting around her, and the card held loosely in her fingers, and though she could not yet prove it, she felt the shape of the truth settle over her like a shadow. Someone was reaching into her life and rearranging it while she slept. Someone with the reach to move money and workmen and machines without ever showing his face, and she needed no name written on that card to know exactly whose silence it belonged to. Nora did not need long to follow the thread, once she had decided to pull it. She made a handful of determined telephone calls, spoke with the care home administrator again, and pressed for the name of the foundation, then visited the modest law office that had handled her grandmother's account, and asked her questions with a quiet stubbornness that the polite young clerk had not been prepared for. One firm led to another, one shell of a name dissolved into the next, and though the trail had been laid with great care to lead nowhere, every path she walked curved back toward the same silent center, toward companies quietly bound to a single man, until at last there could be no doubt left in her mind. Every cleared debt, every mended pipe and humming radiator, every new bolt and camera, even the modest silver car sitting untouched at her curb, all of it flowed from Dante Castellano. The following afternoon, she requested a meeting, and he received her in a high corporate office, overlooking the gray ribbon of the river, expecting perhaps a change of heart, a softened word of thanks, now that she had seen how gently the help had been given. Instead, Nora crossed the room, set the car keys down upon the wide surface of his desk with a small, deliberate click, and let the silence speak first. When she did find her voice, it carried none of the exhaustion he had heard in the parking lot, and all of a frustration she had clearly been holding for days. She told him she was grateful, that she understood he meant it kindly, and that kindness did not give any person the right to reach into another's life and rearrange it while she was not looking, to decide for her which debts should vanish, and which walls should be mended, and how she should get herself home at night. She had spent 3 years learning to stand on her own worn feet, she said, and she would rather keep standing on them, even if it meant walking home in the rain, than have her whole life quietly redrawn by a hand she had never asked for. Dante listened without once interrupting, his dark eyes steady on her face, and when she had finished he did not argue, did not offer the smooth reasoning of a man accustomed to winning, did not remind her of all he could so easily give. He simply inclined his head and told her that she was right, that he had overstepped, and that if it was her wish for him to stop, then he would stop. Nora searched his face for the lie, and found none, and because she had no reason yet to distrust him, she believed him, gathered the last of her frayed composure, and left the office feeling for the first time in days that she had reclaimed some small piece of her own life. Dante remained standing at the tall window long after the door had closed behind her, watching the distant figure of her cross the plaza far below and vanish into the current of the street, and only when she was truly out of sight did he reach for the secure phone on his desk and press a single button. Silas Ward entered a moment later, and Dante did not turn from the glass as he spoke, his voice low and certain, and edged with something that was not quite regret. "She believes I have stopped," he said, "and I want her to go on believing it. But from this night forward she is never to be alone, not on the walk from that office tower, not on the road to see her grandmother, not anywhere. Rotate the men, keep them at a distance she will never notice, and see that not one of them ever lets her know they are there." Silas took the order without a question, and as he left, Dante turned the silver ring slowly upon his finger and looked out over the city he had spent years trying to drag into the light, knowing with grim certainty that the moment his enemies learned who had saved his sister, this stubborn, decent woman who wanted nothing from him would become far more than a debt he could not repay. She would become a target. Dante's grim certainty proved right before the week was out, for the same city that forgets nothing had already begun to whisper Nora's name into the wrong ears. The Voss organization had waited in cold patience for confirmation of their work, and when word reached them at last that Isabella Castellano had not died in the overturned car after all, but had been carried from it by some unknown woman in the rain, their attention turned at once from the sister they had failed to kill, toward the stranger who had robbed them of their victory. They did not have Silas Ward's reach, but they did not need it, for they had something simpler and uglier, a clerk inside the hospital whose loyalty could be bought for a modest envelope of cash, and through that quiet betrayal, the same intake record that had led Dante to Nora's door was copied and passed into hands that meant her nothing but harm. Within days they had her name, her address, and the tower downtown, where she scrubbed floors through the long hours after midnight, and the men Voss sent to study her were careful, professional, and in no hurry at all. They came in ordinary cars that drew no eye, parking a block from the office tower to watch the loading entrance where the cleaning crews came and went, then drifting away before the patrol cars made their rounds and returning the next night in a different vehicle wearing different plates. They noted the hour she arrived, and the hour she left, the route she walked, the nights she drove the silver car she still refused to fully accept, and the nights she left it at the curb, the turn she took toward the care home on her days off. They never approached her, never spoke a word to her, never let her feel the weight of their eyes upon the back of her neck. And to Nora, moving through her exhausted days with the quiet relief of a woman who believed she had won back her own life, the shadow gathering around her remained entirely invisible. But it did not remain invisible to the men Dante had placed at a careful distance behind her. One of Silas's rotating teams marked the first strange car on a Tuesday, an unremarkable sedan that lingered too long and left too smoothly, And by the third night the pattern was undeniable. The changing plates, the rotating vehicles, the practiced way the watchers positioned themselves to see without being seen. Silas studied the reports his men brought him with the still, unhurried attention of a soldier reading terrain before a battle, and he understood at once that what he was looking at was not the clumsy circling of thieves scouting for an easy purse. Thieves did not change their plates each night. Thieves did not chart a woman's schedule with such patience, did not care which route she walked, or when her grandmother expected her. These men were building a map of her life, learning its rhythms and its gaps, marking the moments when she was most alone and least protected, and men did that for only one reason, because they intended, when the moment was right, to take her. Silas brought the reports to Dante himself, rather than trust them to any line that might be overheard, and laid them on the desk without a word of softening. They had found her, he said. Voss had found her, and they were watching her the way a hunter watches a trail before he sets the snare, close and quiet and almost ready. They had not moved yet, not tonight, not this week, but every night of watching brought them nearer to the night they would, and there would be no warning when that night came. Dante stood over the pages in silence, the old cold rage rising in him once more, and he understood with terrible clarity that the very kindness he had tried to give Nora had become the thing that endangered her, that in saving his sister, she had made herself the loose thread his enemies now meant to pull, and that the careful distance he had promised to keep might soon cost far more than his pride ever had. The night they moved came without any warning at all, exactly as Silas had feared it would. Nora finished her shift a little after midnight and stepped out through the service door, into the narrow lot behind the tower, a poorly lit rectangle of cracked asphalt hemmed in by chain-link fencing and the silent bulk of parked delivery trailers, where shallow pools of the previous evening's rain caught the sickly orange glow of the security lamps overhead. She had left the silver car at home that night, still unwilling to lean on a gift she had tried to give back, and so she crossed the lot on foot with her keys already in her hand, and her metal lunch tin tucked under one arm, her thoughts already drifting toward the long walk and the warm bed at the end of it. She had nearly reached the gap in the fence when 3 figures stepped out from between 2 of the parked trailers, hooded and masked, and something in the way they moved froze the breath in her chest before her mind could name the danger. They did not scatter or hesitate the way desperate men did. They spread out with a practiced ease, one coming straight at her, while the other 2 drifted wide to cut off the openings on either side, and past their shoulders, she saw a windowless van idling near the rear gate, with its side door already slid open into the dark. The tallest of them demanded her purse and her keys, in a low, flat voice, but his eyes never once dropped to the things in her hands. They stayed fixed on her face, measuring her, and Nora understood in a rush of cold clarity that whatever these men had come for, it was not her worn wallet. She had been robbed once before, years ago, outside her little flower shop, and that had been a frightened boy who snatched a handful of bills and bolted into the night. This was nothing like that. One of them had a loop of plastic restraint half hidden along his sleeve, another kept glancing back toward the waiting van, and every instinct she had screamed the truth at her, that they did not want what she carried, they wanted her. She took a step back and tightened her grip on the keys until the metal bit into her palm, forcing her voice to stay level even as her heart slammed against her ribs, and when the tall one lunged for her arm, she did the only thing her body knew how to do. She swung the heavy metal lunch tin up into his masked face with every ounce of strength she had, and threw herself sideways toward the gap in the fence. She managed only a few running steps before one of the others caught the back of her coat, and the worn fabric tore at the shoulder as her feet went out from under her, and she came down hard against the wet pavement, the breath knocked from her lungs, a gloved hand closing around her wrist, and another reaching toward her mouth. And then the night came apart. The first sharp crack struck the asphalt a few feet away, deliberately placed, a warning and not a wound, and it froze the 3 masked men where they crouched. Headlights flooded the lot from 2 directions at once, as a pair of dark cars swept in through separate gaps in the fencing, angling hard to box in the idling van, and seal off every path to the gate. And Silas Ward was out of the first vehicle before it had fully stopped, 4 of his men fanning out behind him with the smooth, unhurried discipline of soldiers who had done this many times before. Silas crossed the lot without a shout, and without wasted motion, and when the nearest man reached for something beneath his jacket, Silas closed the distance before the reach was finished, turned the arm aside, and put the man down against the wet ground with a single controlled movement, while behind him his team folded the other 2 just as swiftly and just as cleanly. The whole of it lasted less than a minute, and then the lot was still again but for the rain and Nora's ragged breathing. She stayed where she had fallen, staring up at the strangers who had appeared out of nowhere to stand between her and the open door of that van, unable to make her trembling body rise, and it was in that suspended, ringing quiet that a 3rd car braked hard at the edge of the lot. Dante Castellano was out of it, and moving toward her before the driver had killed the engine, and for the first time since she had met him, the cold, unreadable mask of his face had cracked entirely, giving way to something raw and unguarded and afraid, so that when he reached her side and dropped to one knee on the wet ground, he did not touch her, only searched her face with those dark eyes and asked, in a voice stripped of all its careful steel, whether she was hurt. By the following morning, Silas had drawn from the men the answers Dante needed, and none of them made the fear of the night before any easier to carry. The 3 who had come for Nora had not been sent to harm her, not yet, but to take her alive and unmarked, because a living woman was a key, and a dead one was only a corpse. Voss had understood what Dante had understood, that Nora Whitfield had become the one thread that ran straight to the heart of the Castellano family, and they had planned to seize her and use her as leverage, to trade her safety for access to Isabella, to finish through a hostage what they had failed to finish in the rain. Dante received the report in silence, and when Nora arrived at his office that afternoon, still pale, the torn coat exchanged for a borrowed one, a fading bruise along the heel of one hand, he did not soften the truth for her. He told her plainly what the men had confessed, that they had come to take her, that they had meant to use her against his sister, and that the watching she had never noticed had been the prelude to a night that would have ended very differently had his men not been standing in the dark behind her. Then he told her what he had already decided. Remote protection was no longer enough. He wanted her moved to the Castellano estate, where every road and gate and camera answered to people he trusted, where no van could idle in the dark waiting for her, and Nora refused before he had finished speaking. She would not abandon her apartment and her work, and the small, hard-won independence she had fought to keep, she said. She would not be shut behind stone walls and guarded like a possession. She would not live as a prisoner because of enemies she had never chosen, and a debt she had never asked to be owed. Dante did not raise his voice, and he did not argue about her own safety, because he had already come to understand that her own safety was the one currency she would always spend freely. Instead, he reached into the folder on his desk and drew out a single photograph, and set it down before her without a word. It was the care home on the edge of the city, its plain brick face and the small courtyard of maples, the window behind which an old woman sat waiting for flowers she would forget by evening. The same men who had traced Nora through a bought hospital clerk, he said quietly, could trace the rest of her life just as easily, and they would not need to reach Nora at all if they understood what she loved. They had already shown they would take a hostage to move him. They would take one to move her too, and there was only one person in the world whose loss she could not survive, one person who could no longer run, could no longer understand danger, could no longer protect herself in any way at all. Nora went very still, and the fight drained out of her all at once, because he had reached past every wall she had built and found the single place she could not defend. She could accept the risk to herself, could walk home in the rain 100 nights and gamble her own safety without a second thought, but she could not gamble with Ruth, could not leave the one person who had raised her sitting behind an ordinary door in an ordinary building while men who took hostages learned her name. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and she asked him only one thing: whether her grandmother would truly be safe. Dante told her that a private medical suite would be prepared within the estate, staffed by qualified nurses, that Ruth would want for nothing, and would be watched over every hour of every day, and that no one who wished either of them harm would ever come within sight of those walls. And so Nora agreed, not for her own sake, never for her own sake, but because the only way to keep the last of her family safe was to walk through the gates she had sworn she would never enter, and by that evening the arrangements were already being made to move an old woman and her flowers into the house of the most dangerous man in Chicago. The Castellano estate stood behind high stone walls on the northern edge of the city, a great old house of pale limestone set among autumn woods, its wide windows and ivy-softened terraces, looking out over gardens just beginning to fade beneath the cooling air, and it was nothing like the dark fortress Nora had built in her imagination on the long drive there. The halls inside were elegant and hushed, beautiful in a still, careful way, and yet there hung over all of it a silence so complete that it felt less like peace than like a house holding its breath. She was met at the door by the household manager, a tall and composed woman in her middle 50s named Beatrice Kane, silver threading through her dark hair, her manner formal and precise, and yet warmer beneath the surface than her straight posture suggested, for she had helped raise the family's grief, along with its children, and had a fierce, quiet tenderness for anyone who came under this roof in need of shelter. Beatrice made it plain at once that Nora was to be treated as a guest, and never as a servant, that no door would be locked against her, that her grandmother's suite was already prepared and staffed just down the corridor from her own room, and that she was free to leave the moment Dante judged it safe. Nora had scarcely set down her small bag when there were quick, uneven footsteps in the hall, and she turned to see a young woman standing frozen in the doorway, one hand pressed instinctively to the gentle curve of her belly, staring at her as though at someone risen from a dream. It was Isabella, pale still and moving with the careful slowness of a body not yet fully healed, a faint mark fading at her temple and shadows lingering beneath her dark eyes, but alive, unmistakably alive, breathing and upright and whole in a way that stopped Nora's own breath in her throat. For a moment neither of them moved, and then Isabella crossed the room in a rush and threw both arms around the woman she had known only as a whisper in the rain, a voice telling her to hold on, and the embrace was so sudden and so desperate that Nora nearly lost her balance. Isabella wept against her shoulder, and through the tears came the words tumbling out of her that she remembered so little of that night, only pain and cold and a stranger's arms and a voice that would not let her slip away, only the certainty that she and the child she carried should by every right have died in that overturned car and had not, because a woman she had never met had refused to leave her to the storm. She thanked Nora again and again, one hand still curved over the small life she carried, saying that Nora had not saved one of them but two, that somewhere in the months to come a child would take its first breath in the world only because of what a tired stranger had done in the rain, and Nora, who had spent all these weeks insisting she had done nothing extraordinary, found she had no answer at all, and could only hold the trembling young woman and murmur that she was safe now, that they both were. From the doorway, Dante watched in silence, unnoticed by either of them, and something moved across his severe face that Silas, had he been there to see it, would not have recognized. His sister, who had drifted through the great quiet house like a shadow of herself since the night of the crash, was clinging to this woman and laughing even through her tears, color rising in her cheeks for the first time in days, one hand resting easy and unafraid over her unborn child. And the house itself, which had held its breath for 3 long years, which had grown cold and still and silent in the time since he had buried his wife and locked his own heart away with her, seemed in that single moment to exhale, to warm by some fraction it had forgotten how to hold, and Dante Castellano stood in the shadow of the doorway and understood that the woman who had refused his money and his car and his walls had carried something across his threshold that all his power had never once been able to buy. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm that no one in the great house had quite expected, and at the center of it, without ever meaning to be, was Nora. She had brought little with her, but her own quiet habits, and one of the first was flowers, for Beatrice had given her the run of a sunlit side room off the kitchen, and there Nora began to teach Isabella the old craft she had once made her living from. She showed the young woman how to choose a stem for its strength, and not only its bloom, how to strip a rose of its thorns without bruising the bud, how to build an arrangement outward from a single anchor until the whole of it held together in balance. And Isabella, who had spent 3 years drifting through a house of silence, leaned into the work with the hunger of someone rediscovering that her own hands could make something beautiful. They spoke as they worked, of small things and then of larger ones, of the child coming in the spring and the tiny room being made ready for it, and Nora found herself telling Isabella about the flower shop she had lost, about her grandmother's stories, about the geranium struggling in its cracked pot on her windowsill, until the two women who had met in the worst moment of both their lives became, quietly and without ceremony, something close to friends. In the evenings Nora read aloud, and when Isabella tired, she rested with her feet up and one hand over her belly, while Nora's voice carried through the warm lamplight. And week by week the pallor left the young woman's face, and the careful slowness left her step, until she moved easily through the house again, laughing, restless, well, a woman fully returned to her own life, and counting down the ordinary weeks until her child would come. And into this softening house, Dante came home earlier than he had in years. He told himself it was the danger that drew him back, the need to be near while Voss still circled, but he knew, turning the silver ring on his finger in the back of the car each evening, that it was not the danger at all. It was the sound that met him now when he stepped through the door, the sound of his sister laughing in the side room, of two women's voices tangled together over the scent of cut flowers, a sound the house had not held since before he buried his wife. He would pause in the hall without announcing himself, the cold weight he carried all day loosening by some small degree, and listen. One evening he stood unseen in the doorway and watched Nora guide Isabella's hands around a clumsy, overfull arrangement, watched his sister laugh at the lopsided result, and Nora insist with mock seriousness that it was perfect exactly as it was. And something shifted in his chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and nothing to do with the wary respect he had felt in that parking lot weeks before. He had believed, when he first read her thin file, that his debt to Nora Whitfield was the blood she had given and the life she had pulled from the wreck. He understood now that he had measured it too small. She had not only kept his sister breathing, she had brought her back, had coaxed color and laughter and appetite for the future into a young woman the family had quietly feared they were losing to grief, had filled a house grown cold with something that felt, impossibly, like life. And watching her there in the lamplight, flower of the kitchen still dusting her sleeve, entirely unaware that the most dangerous man in Chicago was standing in his own doorway unable to look away, Dante felt the frost he had let close over his heart 3 years before begin, against every defense he had built, to give way to something he had sworn he would never allow himself to feel again. Life inside the estate had begun to feel almost ordinary, and it was precisely because Nora had grown quiet enough to notice small things that she began to notice the wrong ones. Dante's business was conducted in a secured study on the eastern side of the house, where senior men came and went with folders under their arms and spoke behind doors that were always closed, and Nora neither wished nor tried to listen, but she could not help feeling the way the whole house changed whenever something important was being planned. The extra cars in the drive after dark, the guards rotating more often, the long hours Dante spent behind that closed door with his face growing harder as the night wore on. And then, again and again, something would go wrong. A shipment that should have moved quietly would find men waiting near its route. A meeting arranged in confidence would draw the wrong eyes before Dante's cars ever arrived. Once a delivery had to be turned back entirely because someone was watching the yard where it was meant to unload, and each time Dante blamed corrupted phones or bought officials or watchers in the street. But Nora, who had spent her whole life being invisible in rooms full of people who never noticed her, had learned to watch the way others learned to speak, and she began to see a simpler and far more troubling shape beneath it all. The man who drew her attention was Franklin Doyle, She had marked him from her first days in the house as one of the oldest and most trusted of the men around Dante, a lean, silver-haired figure with wire-framed glasses and a soft, patient voice, treated by the younger guards with the deference usually reserved for family, and she understood why. He had served the Castellanos for 25 years, had stood beside Dante's father before Dante was ever old enough to inherit anything, had, she gathered from a remark of Beatrice's, once pulled a young Dante from a burning car with his own hands and carried the boy to safety, and that single act of long-ago devotion had bought him a place beyond suspicion that no length of service could otherwise have earned. Dante trusted Frank the way a man trusts the ground beneath his feet, without ever once thinking to question it, and it was that very trust, Nora slowly realized, that made him impossible to see clearly. The first time she truly noticed it was during talk of a contract somewhere out toward the docks. Minutes before Dante and his men settled into the study, Frank had stepped out into the corridor and murmured something about needing to take a call from his doctor, and she had thought nothing of it at all until the following day, when she overheard the guards speaking low about a rival crew that had turned up on the very route discussed behind those closed doors. A week or so later, on the evening before a private meeting at one of the family's hotels, Frank had excused himself again in the same soft voice, the same apologetic tilt of the head, another call he simply had to take, and once more the wrong men had appeared near the hotel before Dante's convoy ever reached it. It might have meant nothing. An old man's health was an old man's business, and a coincidence was only a coincidence until it stopped being one. But Nora had learned, in the hardest possible school, that the world rarely rearranged a person's life by accident, and so she began, quietly, to keep track. She took the small notebook she used for her flower recipes, the one filled with margins of penciled stems and ribbon lengths, and in the back of it, she started to write down dates, the nights something important was planned, the moments Frank slipped into the corridor with his phone, the hours that passed before the enemy appeared as though summoned. She forced herself to be careful and to be fair, because she knew better than anyone how easily suspicion could curdle into cruelty, how a single accusation aimed at a trusted man could poison an entire house, and she wrote nothing she had not seen with her own eyes. Yet page by page, date beside date, the pattern refused to soften or scatter. Every time Franklin Doyle left a room where the family's secrets were spoken, the family's enemies seemed to learn them within hours, and the notebook that had once held nothing but the arrangement of flowers began, entry by careful entry, to hold the shape of a betrayal that no one else in the house was willing to see. She brought the notebook to Dante one evening after the house had gone quiet, after Isabella had gone up to bed, and the last of the day's visitors had left through the gates, and she set it before him open to the pages she had filled, and asked him only to read. He did, slowly, turning each leaf in silence, his eyes moving down the columns of dates and hours she had recorded in her careful hand, and she watched his face grow more distant with every page, rather than more troubled, as though a door were quietly closing somewhere behind his eyes. When he reached the end, he did not speak for a long moment, and then he closed the small book and pushed it gently back across the desk toward her. Frank Doyle, he said, had protected his father for 2 decades. Frank had carried him out of a burning car when he was 19 years old, had stood beside this family at his father's funeral, had been loyal since before most of the men who now guarded these walls were even born. He said it quietly, without anger, and that was somehow worse than anger would have been, because Nora understood that she was not arguing against evidence, but against a debt of the heart that no column of dates could touch. She did not press him. She did not accuse the old man again or insist that he was wrong, because she knew how loyalty could harden into a kind of blindness, precisely in the people most worth trusting, and she knew that if she pushed, she would lose him entirely. Instead, she waited a moment, and then she offered him something other than an accusation. She offered him a way to know. Let the dates prove themselves, she said. Give Frank a piece of information that no one else in the house possessed. A shipment, a route, a time, something false, something that existed nowhere but in the words spoken to him alone, and then simply watch, If the schedule was real only in Frank's ear and the enemy still appeared at the appointed place, then the truth would no longer rest on her suspicion or his faith. It would rest on fact, plain and undeniable, and he would never again have to wonder. She had read once, she said, that such a thing had a name in the trade of secrets, that they called it a canary trap, a lie planted so precisely that its echo could only have come from one mouth. Dante was quiet for a long time, turning the silver ring on his finger and looking at the closed notebook between them, and Nora could see the war in him, because the very cleverness of the idea was what he hated about it. He disliked it precisely because it might work, precisely because it offered him a mirror he was afraid to look into, and to set such a trap for Frank Doyle was to admit that some part of him had already begun to doubt the man who had carried him from the fire. But he was not only a brother now, and not only a man defending his own pride. The leaks had already reached toward his sister once, had put a van in a dark lot waiting for the woman sitting across from him, and every failed shipment and compromised meeting was another crack in the walls he had built to keep the people under his roof alive. In the end, it was not Nora who decided him, but the memory of that idling van, and he set his jaw and told her, low and reluctant, that he would do it. He summoned Silas alone the next morning, before Frank or any of the others arrived, and the two men built the lie together in the quiet of the study. There would be a transfer of valuable cargo, they decided, moving through an abandoned freight terminal, out toward the south of the city, in the small hours of a chosen night, and Dante would hand the sealed schedule to Frank himself, and stress that the route was his to coordinate, and his alone, that no other man in the organization was to be told. In truth, no shipment would exist at all. Silas would position his own people through the empty terminal, long before the appointed hour, hidden and waiting, and the only thing that would ever arrive there was whoever came to meet a secret that had been whispered into a single ear. It was a snare with two possible ends, and both of them broke Dante's heart a little, for if it stayed empty, then he had wronged an old friend in his thoughts, and if it did not, then the ground he had trusted beneath his feet for 25 years had never been ground at all. Frank Doyle accepted the sealed envelope the next morning with his usual unhurried calm, and that calm was the cruelest part of all. He listened as Dante stressed that the route was confidential, and his alone to manage. He nodded gravely. He even laid one weathered hand upon Dante's shoulder, and promised, in that soft and patient voice worn smooth by 25 years, that nothing would go wrong. Dante watched him walk away down the long corridor, with the envelope tucked into his coat, and felt a heaviness settle over him that he could not reason away, the particular grief of a man who has set a test he is praying his oldest friend will pass. That night Dante did not go to the terminal. He remained at the estate in the small command room off the study, watching the gray feeds from Silas's concealed cameras flicker on the screens before him, and beside him, because she had refused to be sent away from the thing she had set in motion, sat Nora, silent, her hands folded tight in her lap. The abandoned freight terminal lay dark and still on the monitors, a wasteland of rusted rails and broken loading docks out toward the southern edge of the city, and for a long while nothing moved there but the wind stirring loose paper across the cracked concrete. Then, a little after midnight, 3 vans came down the access road without their headlights, rolling slow and quiet as ghosts, and Nora heard Dante's breath go still beside her. The vans stopped, and men climbed out into the dark, moving with the unmistakable purpose of people who had come expecting a vulnerable convoy and a prize worth taking, spreading toward the loading bays where the phantom cargo was supposed to be waiting. There was no shipment. There had never been a shipment. There was only a lie that had been spoken into one man's ear, and here at last was its echo, made flesh in 3 vanloads of Voss men closing on an empty building, and the sight of them on the screen was a confirmation more absolute than any column of dates in a small notebook could ever have been. Silas gave the word, and the trap closed. Floodlights blazed to life across the terminal, pinning the intruders where they stood, and Silas's people rose from the concealed positions they had held for hours, sealing every exit before the Voss men could think to run. It was over almost before it began, quick and clean and disciplined. The attackers surrounded and taken with no more force than was needed to end it, their weapons on the concrete and their hands behind their heads. And somewhere out beyond the fence, the headlights of the police contacts loyal to the federal investigation waited to receive them. Dante watched it all in silence, and there was no triumph anywhere in his face. On the screen, his enemies were being led away in a defeat so complete it should have satisfied him, and he felt nothing but the slow, cold opening of a wound, because every man taken in that terminal was proof of the one thing he had begged the night not to prove. While the trap was still closing, Silas sent a second team quietly through Frank's private rooms at the estate, and what they found there ended whatever fragile hope Dante had still been holding. Hidden beneath a false drawer lay an encrypted phone that answered to no name in the household, and with it, a folder of banking records tracing years of payments funneled through offshore accounts, sums that no advisor's salary could explain, deposited with a regularity that matched, when Silas laid them beside Nora's notebook, every leak the family had suffered. It was not the record of a man who had faltered once. It was the ledger of a betrayal stretching back years, patient and deliberate and profitable, a slow selling of the family that had trusted him with everything. By dawn, the shape of it was undeniable. Frank's network exposed, the offshore accounts flagged and frozen, his bought men swept up alongside the Voss crew in the terminal, the whole quiet architecture of his treachery pulled into the light in a single night. And Dante Castellano, who had won everything a man in his position could hope to win, sat before the darkened screens turning the silver ring upon his finger and grieving the only thing the victory had cost him, the knowledge that the ground beneath his feet had never once been solid, that the hands which had carried him from the fire when he was 19 had been selling him to the flames ever since. Frank Doyle understood what had happened before anyone came to confront him, because a man who has betrayed for years learns to read the silence of a house the way a sailor reads a darkening sky. He had felt the change the moment the terminal went quiet, and no call came, and rather than return to the estate that night, he abandoned his car near a subway station on the far side of the city and vanished into it. But vanishing was not the same as escaping, and Frank knew that too. His offshore accounts had been flagged and frozen within hours of the trap closing. The money he had spent 2 decades quietly gathering turned overnight into numbers he could no longer touch. The Voss crew that might once have sheltered him sat in federal custody alongside his own bought men, every contact he had cultivated either arrested or scattering to save themselves, every road and rail and airfield out of the city already watched by people loyal to Dante or to the investigation drawing tight around them all. He had no crew left to command, no fortune left to buy passage, no ally left who would answer his call, and a man stripped of all his instruments is left holding only his desperation. And desperation, in a man like Frank, did not turn toward flight, it turned toward leverage. He knew he could not run, and so he reasoned, in the cold arithmetic of a cornered man, that his only remaining path was to seize something valuable enough to trade for his own freedom. And there was only one thing in the world that Dante Castellano valued above his own life. Not money, which Dante had in endless supply. Not territory, which he had already begun surrendering to the daylight of the law. There was only Isabella, the last of his blood, the sister he had nearly lost once already, and the child she carried toward the spring, and Frank understood better than anyone alive how completely Dante would empty himself to keep her safe. So he did not leave Chicago. He went to ground within it, watching from the shadows he had haunted for 25 years, waiting for the single gap in the walls that all his old knowledge told him would eventually open, because no fortress is guarded equally at every hour, and no family, however careful, stays behind its stone forever. The gap came on an ordinary gray afternoon, and it came, as these things so often do, dressed as nothing at all. Isabella had a prenatal appointment that had been on the household calendar for weeks, the routine kind that a healthy young woman well into an untroubled pregnancy keeps without a second thought, and the driver who was meant to take her had been caught up by another obligation that ran long past its hour. Beatrice Kane, moving through the day's small logistics with her usual quiet efficiency, found herself short one pair of hands at exactly the wrong moment, and it seemed the most natural solution in the world to ask Nora. Isabella was well now, restless and glad of any excuse to leave the estate, and she trusted Nora completely, and Nora had the silver car and no fear of the city, and so Beatrice asked her, without the smallest shadow of misgiving, whether she would mind driving Isabella to her appointment and bringing her safely home. Nora agreed at once, because of course she did, because helping was the only reflex she had ever known, and the two women who had become friends over cut flowers and quiet evenings gathered their coats and stepped out toward the car in the thin autumn light. Neither of them had any way of knowing that the walls had opened just wide enough, that somewhere beyond the gates a desperate man with nothing left to lose had been waiting precisely for a day like this one, or that the small ordinary errand of keeping an appointment was about to carry both of them directly into the path of the only enemy still free to strike. The clinic occupied the upper floors of a quiet medical building near the lake, and the appointment itself passed without incident, so that it was only afterward, as the two women crossed the wide lobby toward the doors, that Nora saw him. He stood near the entrance in a tan coat that did not quite fit the way his usual tailored suits had, a visitor's badge clipped to his lapel, his wire-framed glasses gone and his silver hair combed differently, and to anyone who had known him only in passing, he might have been any weary older man waiting out of the cold. But Nora had spent weeks watching the particular set of Franklin Doyle's shoulders across crowded rooms, had trained herself to notice exactly him, and no change of coat or comb could disguise the rigid, waiting stillness of the man she had tracked through the pages of a flower notebook. In the same instant that she recognized him, his eyes found hers, and the mild, patient mask he had worn for 25 years fell away entirely, and she understood that he had recognized that she knew. She did not hesitate. She took Isabella's arm and turned her smoothly back toward the interior of the building before the young woman had even seen him, murmuring that they had forgotten something upstairs, keeping her voice light so the fear would not spread, and she slipped one hand into her coat pocket and pressed the phone she always carried now, sending Dante her live location and 3 words that needed no others. "Frank is here." Behind them she heard the change in the room, the quick, heavy steps, and then Frank stopped pretending altogether and called Isabella's name across the lobby, in a voice cracked open by desperation, telling them to stop, to wait. Nora did the opposite. She pulled Isabella through a set of fire doors and hauled them shut behind her, throwing the bolt that locked them from the inner side, and knowing it would not hold a determined man for long, she seized a heavy janitor's cart standing against the corridor wall and dragged it hard against the handles, then wedged a second supply trolley beside it. Isabella's calm had begun to fracture now. Her hand pressed protective and instinctive over the curve of her belly, her questions coming faster, and Nora crouched before her for the space of a single breath and took her by the shoulders and told her, steadily, that Dante was already coming, that she had only to stay close and move when Nora moved, and everything would be all right. She did not know if it was true. She only knew there was one thing that mattered, and nothing else did. The same single certainty that had carried her through a burning wreck in the rain weeks before. Keep them alive. Keep them both alive. Nothing else exists. The doors shuddered as Frank threw his weight against them, the cart screeching a few inches across the tile, and Nora pulled Isabella down the corridor as fast as the young woman could safely go, her eyes sweeping the walls as she ran. When the fire doors finally gave and Frank forced his way through the gap, Nora had already lifted a red extinguisher from its bracket on the wall, and she turned and swept it across the opening in a great choking cloud of white, filling the narrow corridor with a fog that blinded him and drove him back with his arm thrown up across his face, buying the seconds she needed to press on. She led Isabella through a fire stairwell and down toward the ground floor, overturning a laundry hamper across the landing behind them to foul his footing, dragging one more heavy door shut at every chance, improvising with whatever the building offered, because she had no weapon, and no training, and nothing at all but her wits, and her refusal to let him reach the woman at her side. Frank came after them through the fog and the scattered obstacles, his soft, patient voice gone entirely now, growing more frantic with each barrier she threw in his path. And Nora was terrified, her hands shaking and her breath tearing in her chest. But the terror no longer had any command over her body. Every decision came clean and fast, born of the same instinct that lived beneath all her exhaustion and all her losses, the plain animal need to stand between danger and the vulnerable and not move. She got Isabella to a service exit at the rear of the building, out into the gray afternoon and the first distant wail of sirens, and put her own body squarely between the young woman and the door they had just come through, holding a length of pipe she had pulled from a maintenance rack in both trembling hands, ready, if it came to it, to be the last thing standing in Franklin Doyle's way. The sirens that had been a distant wail rose all at once into a wall of sound, and the gray afternoon behind the building filled with light and engines as dark cars swung hard into the service lane and police vehicles sealed the mouth of the alley beyond them. Dante was out of the first car before it had fully stopped, moving faster than Nora had ever seen him move, Silas a half-step behind him with 4 men fanning out to flood the building, and the sight of him crossing that broken pavement toward them undid something in Nora that she had been holding rigid for what felt like hours. Frank came through the service door into the open at almost the same moment, driven out of the fogged corridors and into the light, and for one suspended instant, the desperate man and the woman he had hunted, and the young mother she had shielded, all stood frozen in the same gray square of afternoon. Frank's hand moved toward something beneath the ill-fitting coat, one last frantic reach of a man who had already lost everything, but he never completed it. Silas crossed the distance the way he had crossed the dark lot weeks before, without a wasted motion and without a word, turning the reach aside before it could become anything, and bringing the older man down against the pavement, and the guards closed around him and secured his hands, and it was finished, cleanly and completely. Franklin Doyle taken alive with the whole of his treachery still written plain across his face. Isabella made a small broken sound and ran, and Dante caught her as she reached him and folded her against his chest, one hand cradling the back of her head as she wept into his coat, her whole body shaking with the terror she had held back for her unborn child's sake, and over her shoulder his dark eyes swept the alley until they found Nora. She was still standing a few feet from the service door, exactly where she had planted herself between the danger and the door, the length of pipe still gripped in both hands, white extinguisher powder dusting her hair, and her shoulders like ash, and only now, with Frank on the ground and Isabella safe in her brother's arms, and the sirens washing everything in their turning light, did her body finally understand that it was over. The pipe slipped from her fingers and rang against the pavement, and her hands began at last to shake, the tremor she had not permitted herself while it mattered arriving all at once now that it no longer did, and she stood there trembling and hollowed out and unable to quite believe that they had lived. Dante did not let go of his sister, but he looked at Nora across that small ruined space with an expression she had never seen him wear, and it was not the wary curiosity of the parking lot, nor the guarded respect of the weeks since, but something cracked wide open and utterly without defense. He had believed, once, that his debt to this woman was the blood she had given his sister in a hospital and the life she had carried through the rain, and he had thought that debt already immeasurable. Now he understood that he had never finished counting it. She had stood in a burning night for a stranger, and she had stood again in a fogged corridor with nothing in her hands, for a woman she had come to love, had thrown every obstacle her wits could find between Franklin Doyle and the last of the Castellano blood, had kept his sister and his sister's child alive, with no weapon, and no training, and nothing at all but the same stubborn refusal that had defined her from the first. Twice now she had saved his family. Twice a woman who wanted nothing from him had given everything she had, and as the police moved in, and the powder settled slowly through the cold air, and Isabella clung to him still weeping her relief, Dante Castellano looked at Nora Whitfield, standing spent and shaking in the gray light, and knew, with a certainty that frightened him more than any enemy ever had, that whatever he felt for her had long since passed beyond gratitude, and beyond respect, into something he no longer had any wish to deny. The weeks that followed changed the shape of the city more quietly than anyone outside the investigation would ever understand. Franklin Doyle, taken alive and stripped of every account and ally that had made him dangerous, had nothing left to bargain with but what he knew, and what he knew, gathered over 25 years at the heart of the Castellano family, proved to be a great deal. The encrypted phone and the frozen offshore records were only the beginning. For once he understood that his silence would buy him nothing, Frank began to talk, and every payment, coded message, and secret meeting he described formed another link in a chain that stretched far beyond one trader and one rival crew, running from bought officials to the men at the top of the Voss organization who had believed themselves untouchable. It was the moment at which a different man in Dante's place might have buried it all, might have taken his private revenge in the shadows, and salted the rest away, to protect the empire his father had built through fear. Dante did the opposite, and in doing so he kept the promise he had made to himself long before Nora ever entered his life. Rather than bury the evidence, he ordered every document, every record, every thread Frank's confession had loosened, to be delivered into the hands of the federal investigators who had been circling the organization for years. The man who came most often to receive it was Special Agent David Mercer, a lean and weathered investigator in his late 40s with close-cropped brown hair and thoughtful gray eyes, a man who had spent 2 decades dismantling exactly the kind of empire the Castellanos had once been, and who judged those before him by the choices they made rather than by the names they carried. Working beside him was Assistant United States Attorney Helen Cross, a composed and formidable woman in her early 40s, with an unbending reputation for prosecuting organized crime without regard to influence or favor, and she reviewed every page Dante surrendered, verified every transfer, and coordinated the warrants that fell across the city in a single coordinated dawn. Within weeks, the rival organization that had ordered the attack on Isabella's car, that had put a van in a dark lot waiting for Nora, that had fed for years on the secrets Frank sold them, simply ceased to exist. Its leaders were arrested, its financial network frozen and unwound, and the officials who had accepted its money found themselves named in federal indictments they had never imagined would reach them. Frank himself would answer for his own long betrayal before the same law he had spent a career helping the family evade, and the Voss name, once whispered with fear in the same breath as the Castellano name, dissolved into a string of case numbers and courtroom dates. Dante gave his testimony where it was needed, and his records where they were asked for, and he did it without flinching, and without seeking any credit, because the point had never been to be seen doing right, but simply to finish the work of dragging his father's empire fully into the light. And when it was done, when the last warrant had been served, and the last account seized, and the men who had reached twice for his family sat waiting on the wrong side of steel, Dante Castellano stood one evening at the tall windows of his study and looked out over the skyline of Chicago, and for the first time in more years than he could easily count, he did not scan it for threats. He did not wonder which unseen rival was even now planning the next move against him, did not read the distant lights as positions on a board he had to defend. The war that had shadowed him since long before his wife's death had, at last, quietly ended, not with the violence his father would have chosen, but with the daylight Dante had chosen instead, and the city beyond the glass was only a city now, ordinary and vast and at peace. Somewhere below it Isabella was safe, her child still coming with the spring, and somewhere in a warm side room the scent of cut flowers still lingered, and Dante turned the silver ring slowly on his finger and let himself feel, cautiously, like a man setting down a weight he had carried so long he had forgotten its shape, the strange unfamiliar quiet of having nothing left to fear. With the danger gone, there was no longer any reason to keep Nora and her grandmother behind the estate's stone walls, and everyone in the house understood it, though no one spoke of it for several days. Ruth had been well cared for in her private suite, but the doctors gently observed that a woman whose memory was already slipping did better among the familiar than the grand, and so arrangements were quietly made to return her to the care home with the courtyard of maples she had come, in her own dim way, to know. Nora spent her last days at the house helping Isabella finish the little room being made ready for the spring, pressing a farewell into the young woman's hands that neither of them had the words for, and Beatrice Kane, who had welcomed her with such formal composure, discreetly turned away to wipe her eyes when she thought no one was looking, pretending instead to adjust the blanket across Ruth's knees. On the morning Nora left, Dante walked her to her car himself, and for the first time since she had known him, no guards were trailing a few steps behind, no dark cars idling at the edge of the drive, only the two of them and the autumn wind, carrying the scent of fallen leaves across the long gravel. For a while neither of them spoke. Nora thanked him, at last, for keeping her grandmother safe, for giving them both the gift of living without fear, and Dante shook his head almost before she had finished, as though he could not bear to accept gratitude for something he considered so plainly owed. He looked out toward the sunlight breaking through the bare trees, and then he turned back to her with the same quiet sincerity she had first seen in a parking lot outside a nursing home a lifetime ago, and he told her that she had it exactly backward. "You saved my family," he said, and his low voice did not waver. Not once. He paused for the space of a single breath. Twice. Nora lowered her eyes, the burning car and the fogged corridor rising together in her memory, but before she could find any answer, he went on, and what he said next was not a plea and not a promise of anything grand. He told her that he would never force her to do anything, not where to live, not where to work, not what kind of future to choose, that he had learned from her the one lesson all his power had never taught him, that kindness which took away another person's freedom was not kindness at all. There was no confession of love in it, and no dramatic vow that the road ahead would be easy. There was only respect, offered freely and without conditions between two people who had already changed the whole course of each other's lives, and Nora understood it for exactly what it was, and it was worth more to her than the case of money he had once set upon the hood of a car. She smiled at him, softly, thanked him one final time, and drove away with Ruth dozing peacefully in the seat beside her, back toward the city and the ordinary life she had fought so hard to keep. But the life she returned to was not quite the one she had left. The crushing debt that had bent her for 3 years was gone, and with it the fear that violent strangers might one night be waiting in the dark. And so, instead of searching for another factory shift or another tower to scrub through the small hours, Nora unlocked the door of the dusty little storefront on the quiet corner where her flower shop had once stood. The old refrigerated cases needed mending, the shelves wanted fresh paint, the faded sign above the door hung by a single stubborn bracket, but where a stranger would have seen only ruin, Nora saw something else entirely. She saw a beginning. Former neighbors drifted in to greet her, startled and glad that the quiet florist everyone had missed was somehow returning, and one bucket of stems at a time, one swept floor and mended hinge at a time, she began to rebuild the dream she had long believed was gone for good. And in the small back room where the afternoon light fell warm across the tiles, Ruth would sit among the greenery on the good days, and the lost ones alike, and though she often could not say her granddaughter's name, her face would soften every single time the scent of fresh flowers filled the air, as if somewhere far beneath the fog, some memory of love had refused, after everything, to be carried away. A year passed, and it passed in peace. Dante Castellano completed the long work of dragging the last of his family's holdings into the daylight, until the companies that bore his name employed thousands honestly across the city, and the newspapers wrote of hotel openings and charitable trusts, where once they had whispered of fear, and the man who had spent his life bracing for the next unseen blow, slowly learned how to live in a world that had stopped threatening him. Yet his favorite destination each morning was not the gleaming headquarters downtown, but a small corner flower shop where warm light spilled through the windows before the rest of the street had fully woken. Almost every day he stopped there on his way into the city to buy fresh flowers, and almost every day he left with far more than he had come for, because Nora always insisted he try a new arrangement or take home a stem she thought Isabella would like. and their conversations drifted easily from business to books, from Ruth's good days to the quiet, ordinary triumphs of the shop. Two people letting trust deepen into something neither of them felt any need to name. For there are promises that grow stronger precisely because they are never spoken aloud, and what had grown between Nora and Dante needed no confession to be real. It lived in the bell above the door each morning, in the way he stayed a little longer than a man buying flowers needed to stay, in the way her face lifted when she heard his car, and both of them seemed content to let it simply go on becoming part of an ordinary life, the way a garden becomes a garden not in a single day, but in 1,000 small mornings of care. In the spring, Isabella's child had come safely into the world, and the shop became the family's favorite place in the city, for she would carry the baby in on quiet afternoons and settle into the warm back room among the greenery, and Ruth, on her good days and her lost ones alike, would smile at the small new life the way she smiled at the flowers, as though some part of her recognized that both were the same kind of miracle. One golden autumn afternoon, with the light falling long and amber across the wooden floor exactly as another autumn had once fallen cold and gray across a rain-black street, the three of them stood together among the buckets of fresh stems, and Isabella's little one slept nearby, and Nora looked around the small bright room she had raised a second time from ruin, and understood how far she had come from the tired woman who had walked home alone in the storm. It had begun in the rain, on a night when a stranger's life was fading in her arms, and it had come to rest here in the sunlight, in a shop she had lost and won back, among people who had been strangers and had chosen, one quiet decision at a time, to become a family. Sometimes a miracle does not arrive with thunder or with blinding light. Sometimes it arrives as an ordinary person, standing in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, choosing kindness when kindness costs everything and promises nothing in return. Nora Whitfield had never held power, or wealth, or influence. She had held only a good heart and the scars of a hard life, and yet that heart, on one rainy night, had reached out and changed the fate of everyone it touched, and in saving strangers, she had, without ever meaning to, saved herself. Perhaps that is how miracles most often come to us, not through extraordinary people, but through ordinary hearts willing to choose compassion when it matters most. And perhaps none of us ever truly knows the moment we are given the chance to become the answer to someone else's silent prayer. If this story touched your heart in any way, we would be so grateful if you would take a moment to subscribe to our channel, to like this video, and to share it with your family and friends, so that more people can discover stories of courage, kindness, and hope like this one every single day. We would love to know how this story made you feel, so please leave a comment and tell us which part moved you the most, because it means the world to us to hear what stirs in the hearts of those who listen. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. We wish every one of you watching good health, a joyful life, and peaceful, gentle days ahead. Until we meet again in the next video, take care of yourselves, and goodbye for now.